The baby wasn't supposed to survive the night. That's what the doctor said later, under fluorescent lights that never flickered, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and quiet miracles. But hours before that sentence was spoken, there was only wind, howling, endless, cutting across an empty highway in northern Colorado where the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees Fahrenheit and falling fast, and somewhere off that road, barely visible beneath sheets of snow, a woman lay on her side trying to remember how to breathe. Her name was Emily Carter, and 8 months earlier she had been planning a nursery painted soft yellow with hand-stitched blankets folded neatly in a crib she thought would be safe. She had believed in safety back then, believed in promises, believed in the man who once held her hand at a summer gala and whispered that she would never have to face the world alone. But belief is fragile in winter, and on that night, belief had already frozen and shattered somewhere between mile marker 47 and the sound of a car door closing behind her. Because the truth is this, Emily hadn't wandered into the storm, she had been left there, deliberately, quietly, as if she were something inconvenient that could be set aside and forgotten. And as the wind pressed against her skin through layers that were never meant for this kind of cold, she curled slightly, instinctively, one hand resting over her stomach where a small, stubborn life still moved. Still fought, still refused to understand the danger that surrounded them, and for a moment, just a moment, everything slowed, the storm muffled, the world narrowed down to a single fragile rhythm beneath her palm, a reminder that she was not alone even if the road behind her had emptied of headlights, even if the man who once called her his future had driven away without looking back, and miles away, though she didn't know it yet, another engine was running, steady and deliberate. A truck cutting through the same storm on a route that had been changed at the last minute for reasons that didn't make sense at the time, the driver checking his mirrors, adjusting his grip on the wheel, unaware that a single decision, one exit taken instead of another, was about to intersect with a story that millions would later replay again and again, calling it fate, calling it luck, calling it something larger than coincidence. But in that exact moment, there was no audience, no headlines, no miracle yet, just a woman on the edge of consciousness and a child who had not yet taken a breath, and somewhere in the distance, buried beneath layers of wind and white, the faintest glow of headlights beginning to move in her direction. The cold did not arrive all at once, it crept in slowly, like a quiet decision the body could not argue with, first the fingers, then the arms, then a heaviness in her legs that made every movement feel like walking through water, and Emily Carter understood something in that moment that no one had ever prepared her for, that survival was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was quiet and stubborn and painfully slow. She shifted slightly against the snow, forcing herself to stay awake, because somewhere deep inside her mind a voice kept repeating the same instruction over and over again. Do not fall asleep, do not close your eyes, not now, not when someone else was depending on her to stay. And as another sharp wave of pressure moved through her body, she inhaled sharply, the sound barely audible against the wind, her hand pressing more firmly against her stomach as if she could shield the life inside from everything happening outside. And for a second she tried to remember warmth. The feeling of sunlight through a window, the hum of a quiet home, the soft way Daniel used to say her name before everything changed, before the late nights turned into distance, before conversations became silence, before silence became something colder than the storm. And she did not allow herself to finish that thought because thinking about him now felt like stepping into another kind of emptiness, one that offered no answers and no way back. And somewhere far behind her, the road remained invisible, erased by wind and time, as if the world had already decided to move on without her. But then something shifted, not outside, not yet, but within her, a stronger movement, more urgent, a reminder that time was not waiting, that the moment she had imagined in safe rooms and careful plans was arriving here instead, unannounced and unforgiving, and she drew in a breath that burned her lungs, steadying herself in a way that did not look like strength, but was, because strength in that moment meant staying present, staying conscious, staying there. And miles away the truck continued forward, headlights cutting through layers of snow that seemed endless, the driver narrowing his eyes against the glare, noticing how the road had become almost indistinguishable from the land around it, a flat expanse of white and shadow, and he considered turning back, just for a second. Because conditions like this were not worth the risk, not worth the delay, not worth the uncertainty. But something held him there, something small and unexplainable, the kind of hesitation that feels insignificant until it changes everything. And so he kept going, tires gripping the road with careful persistence, engine steady, moving closer to a point he did not know existed. While back in the snow, Emily felt the world narrowing again, the edges of her vision softening, her breathing slower now, more deliberate, and she whispered something into the storm, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, not even for herself to fully recognize, but it carried the weight of everything she had left, and for a brief second, just before her eyes began to close, the wind shifted direction, and in that shift, faint and distant, there was light. Light does not usually feel loud, but in that moment it did. It cut through the storm with a presence that did not belong to the silence of the snow, two beams stretching across the road and spilling outward into the white emptiness. And somewhere beneath that glow, almost invisible against the ground, Emily Carter lay still, her breathing shallow, her body no longer fighting in the same urgent way it had just minutes before. Because there is a point where exhaustion begins to imitate peace, where the mind starts to drift not out of choice but out of necessity, and she was dangerously close to that edge, her hand still resting protectively where the faint movement inside her had not stopped, had not given up, had not allowed the storm to define its ending. And as the truck moved forward, tires crunching against layers of ice and snow, the driver leaned slightly toward the windshield, narrowing his eyes. Because something in the road ahead did not look right, not debris, not shadow. Something softer, uneven, out of place in a landscape that had become almost perfectly flat, and instinct does not announce itself with words, it arrives as a pause, a hesitation in the hands, a subtle pressure on the brake before the mind catches up, and he slowed, just enough to question what he was seeing, just enough to give the moment time to reveal itself, and then it did, a shape, human, unmoving, partially covered by drifting snow that had already begun to erase the outline, and the truck came to a stop. Engine humming steadily as if unaware that everything had just shifted, and for a brief second the world held its breath, the storm continuing its endless motion while inside the cab there was only stillness, the kind that exists right before a decision is made, and then the door opened, cold air rushing in, sharp and immediate, breaking whatever separation had existed between safety and what lay outside, and he stepped down carefully, boots pressing into the snow, each step deliberate, closing the distance between what he thought he saw and what he now knew was real, and as he reached her, he lowered himself without hesitation, his voice calm, steady, the kind of voice that does not panic because it has learned not to, even when the situation demands urgency. He spoke to her as if she could hear him, as if the connection mattered even if she did not respond, because sometimes presence is the first form of rescue, and as he gently checked for signs that she was still there, still holding on. There was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough, just enough to confirm what the storm had not taken, and in that instant the situation transformed from uncertainty to purpose, from observation to action, and he moved quickly now, not rush, not careless, but with a precision that suggested this was not the first time he had stepped into the unexpected, that he understood the weight of moments like this, and back inside the truck, warmth waited, limited but real. A temporary barrier against a night that had no intention of easing, and as he carefully lifted her, supporting both her and the fragile life she carried, the storm continued to rage around them, indifferent, relentless, but no longer uncontested, because somewhere between a misturn and a decision to keep driving, something had intervened, something quiet and unplanned, and as the truck door closed behind them, sealing in what little heat it could offer, the road ahead was no longer just a route, it was a race against time. Warmth inside the truck did not feel like comfort, it felt like resistance, a fragile line drawn against everything waiting outside, and as the door sealed shut, the sound of the storm dulled just enough to make the small space feel real, contained, survivable, and he moved quickly but carefully, adjusting the heater, reaching for a thick blanket from behind the seat, wrapping it around Emily Carter with a precision that came from experience rather than panic, because panic wastes time and time was already running thin, her skin cold to the touch, her breathing uneven but still there, still holding on, and he spoke again, not louder this time, just steady, the kind of voice that anchors a moment even when the person hearing it cannot respond, telling her she was safe now, telling her to stay with him, telling her something simple and clear, because sometimes the mind clings to the simplest things when everything else begins to fade. And as he checked the road ahead through the windshield, visibility shifting with every gust of wind, he made a decision without hesitation, not the nearest town, not the route he had planned, but the closest medical facility he knew could handle something like this, calculating distance in miles and minutes, weighing risk against necessity. And then the truck was moving again, tires gripping the icy road, engine steady but pushed just enough to matter. And inside that moving space, something changed, not outside, not in the storm, but within Emily, a small but unmistakable shift, a signal that time was not just limited, it was immediate, and he noticed it instantly. The subtle tension, the change in her breathing, the way her hand tightened slightly over her stomach, and he adjusted again, one hand on the wheel, the other briefly reaching to secure the blanket more firmly, to make sure she was supported, to make sure she was not slipping away in silence. Because silence in moments like this can be misleading, it can feel calm when it is anything but, and the miles stretched ahead of them, each one carrying weight, each one a calculation he did not speak out loud. And somewhere between 1 mile marker and the next, the truck became more than transportation. It became a moving line between what had almost been lost and what still had a chance, and then it happened, not suddenly, not violently, but with a quiet urgency that filled the space without warning, a sound, small but undeniable, the kind of sound that does not need explanation, and for a fraction of a second he closed his eyes, not in hesitation, but in focus. Because this was the moment everything narrowed down to. Not the storm, not the road, not the distance left to drive, but right here. Inside the cab, where 2 lives depended on what happened next, and he slowed slightly, not stopping, not yet, but adjusting, balancing movement with control, because stopping completely in a storm like this could mean losing momentum, losing time, losing everything they had gained, and so he kept the truck moving, steady and deliberate, while shifting his attention fully to her, guiding her through something he knew could not wait, his voice calm, measured, repeating simple instructions, grounding her in the present even as the world outside continued to disappear into white, and as the storm pressed against the windows, relentless and indifferent, inside that truck something else was happening, something quieter, something stronger, something that refused to be erased, and for the first time since the night began, the outcome was no longer entirely controlled by the storm. Time inside the truck stopped behaving like time, it stretched and folded into moments that felt both too fast and impossibly slow, and Emily Carter existed somewhere in between, not fully aware, not fully gone, held in that fragile space where instinct takes over when thought can no longer keep up, and the sound that had filled the cab only seconds before changed, shifting from uncertainty into something clearer, something alive. And he did not hesitate, not even for a breath, his movements. Precise, controlled, guided by a calm that did not come from luck but from a life that had seen urgency before, he adjusted the truck again, bringing it to a gradual stop on a narrow shoulder where the wind hit hardest, because there are moments when forward motion is no longer the priority, when what matters is right in front of you, and he turned fully toward her, anchoring the space with his presence, his voice steady, repeating simple instructions that cut through the confusion, telling her to focus, to stay with him, to hold on just a little longer, and outside the storm roared without pause, snow striking the windows in sharp bursts, wind pressing against the frame as if trying to reclaim what had been taken from it, but inside, something else was unfolding, something that did not belong to the storm at all, and for a moment there was tension, a silence that stretched just long enough to raise doubt. Just long enough to make the outcome uncertain again, and then it broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a sound so small it could have been missed if the world had been any louder, and everything shifted in that instant, because that sound meant presence, it meant continuation, it meant that against everything, something had endured, and he let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders lowering just slightly, but his focus did not waver, not yet. Because survival is not a single moment, it is a sequence, and each part matters, and he moved. quickly to secure both of them, ensuring warmth, ensuring stability, ensuring that what had just happened would not be undone by what came next. And as he reached for his phone, the signal flickered, unreliable in the storm, but enough, just enough to connect, to call ahead, to prepare what waited beyond the miles still ahead of them, his voice changing slightly now, still calm but carrying urgency, giving details, location, condition, making sure that when they arrived, there would be no delay. No hesitation, no wasted second, and when the call ended, he did not pause, he returned immediately to the road, the truck pulling back into motion, cutting once again through the storm that had not weakened, had not softened, had not offered any sign of mercy. And yet inside that moving space, the balance had changed. What had once been a race against loss had become a fight to preserve what had been saved, and Emily, though still drifting at the edge of awareness, held on to something new now. Something faint but undeniable, a presence beside her that did not disappear, a voice that did not leave, and somewhere deep within that fragile space, her body responded, not with strength, not yet, but with persistence, and as the truck pushed forward mile after mile, headlights slicing through endless white, the storm no longer felt like the only force shaping the night, because now there was something else moving through it, something quiet, deliberate, and unyielding. The road did not get easier, it only became more uncertain, the kind of uncertainty that forces every movement to matter, every second to carry weight, and as the truck pushed forward through the storm, the headlights revealed only fragments of what lay ahead, a few feet of asphalt, a blur of white, then nothing again, and yet he did not slow beyond what was necessary, because hesitation now could cost more than risk. And inside the cab, the air had shifted, warmer but still tense, filled with the quiet aftermath of something that had changed everything, and Emily Carter remained on that fragile edge, her body no longer fighting in bursts but holding on in a steady, determined way, her breathing shallow but present, and beside her, wrapped carefully, the smallest life made its existence known in the simplest way possible, not loud, not demanding, just there, a soft reminder that against everything, it had arrived. And he checked again briefly, his movements efficient, making sure both of them were stable, that nothing had been overlooked in the urgency of the moment, and then his focus returned to the road, because now the goal was clear, not survival alone, but arrival, reaching a place where others could take over, where the weight of responsibility could be shared, and miles away, lights began to appear, faint at first, almost mistaken for reflections in the storm, but then clearer, steadier. A small cluster of buildings sitting at the edge of the highway like a promise that had not yet been broken, and he adjusted course slightly, guiding the truck toward that point with precision, calculating distance not just in miles but in time, in breaths, in the quiet persistence of the two lives behind him, and as they drew closer, the outline of the facility sharpened, a rural medical center, not large, not grand, but open, illuminated, ready in the way that matters most. And he reached for his phone again, confirming their approach, his voice calm but direct, giving final details, ensuring that when he arrived, there would be no confusion, no delay, and when he pulled into the entrance, the tires crunching against packed snow, the world outside shifted once more, from isolation to response, from silence to movement, figures emerging through the storm, prepared, focused, stepping forward without hesitation, and he brought the truck to a stop, engine idling as if reluctant to let go of what it had carried this far, and for a brief second, everything paused again, the kind of pause that marks the end of one struggle and the beginning of another, and he turned back toward Emily, his voice softer now, but still steady, telling her they had made it, telling her she was not alone anymore, and as the door opened and cold air rushed in once again, it no longer felt like an enemy, it felt like something they had already passed through, something that no longer held control over what came next, and as careful hands reached in, taking over, lifting, guiding, the responsibility shifted. But the moment remained, because what had happened on that road, in that storm, in that narrow space between loss and survival, had already rewritten everything, and somewhere deep within that fragile quiet, Emily held on to the one thing that mattered most, not the storm behind her, not the man who left, but the small, steady presence that had refused to disappear. The doors did not open gently, they moved with purpose, pushed wide against the wind as figures stepped forward with a clarity that cut through the chaos of the storm, voices calm but direct, hands steady, each motion practiced in a way that did not require explanation, and in that moment the night changed again, no longer a place of isolation but a space filled with response, and as Emily Carter was carefully guided from the truck, the transition was seamless, from one set of hands to another, from one form of protection to the next, and though her awareness flickered, rising and falling like a signal barely holding on, there was something new in it now, something anchored, a sense that the fight she had been carrying alone was no longer hers to bear by herself, and the small life beside her was quickly secured, wrapped, checked, monitored with a quiet efficiency that spoke louder than urgency ever could. And the sound inside the building shifted everything, no longer wind, no longer silence, but controlled movement, soft voices, steady beeping from machines that measured what could not be seen, and as she was moved down a narrow hallway under bright lights that erased the darkness of the road behind her, the storm became something distant, something outside the walls, something that no longer dictated the outcome, and behind her, just for a moment, he remained still, standing at the threshold between the outside and the inside, snow still clinging to his coat, the cold still following him in, and he watched as they disappeared through the doors, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with a quiet certainty that what needed to happen next was already in motion, and then he stepped forward, crossing that line fully, leaving the storm behind in a way that felt final, and inside, time took on a different rhythm, measured not in miles or distance but in progress, in small changes that meant everything, and somewhere in that process, a nurse paused, looking at him with a brief moment of recognition that did not belong to the situation. Her eyes narrowing slightly as if placing something familiar, something she had seen before but could not immediately name, and she asked a simple question, one that should not have carried weight but did, asking for his name, and he answered without hesitation, his voice the same calm tone that had carried through the storm. Michael Hayes. And for a fraction of a second the room shifted again, not outwardly, not enough for anyone rushing past to notice, but just enough for the nurse to still, just enough for something unspoken to register, because that name was not unfamiliar, not in a place like this, not in a system that had seen its share of news, of headlines, of stories that moved beyond small towns and into something larger, and she nodded quickly, returning to her task without comment, but the moment lingered, subtle and quiet, like everything else that had happened that night, and as the doors to the treatment room closed, sealing Emily and her child inside a space of care and control, Michael remained just outside, not pacing, not speaking. Simply waiting, because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stay, and in the stillness of that hallway, under lights that never dimmed, the storm that had begun the night felt impossibly far away, replaced by something else entirely, something quieter, something steadier, something that had already begun to change the story. Waiting does not always look like action, but it carries its own kind of weight, and in that hallway, under lights that hummed softly above, time moved in a way that felt unfamiliar, stretched thin between each passing second, measured not by clocks but by the opening and closing of a single door at the end of the corridor, and Michael Hayes remained exactly where he had been, not because he did not have somewhere else to be, but because leaving now would mean breaking something that had been built in silence, and inside that room, beyond the closed doors, everything continued without pause, voices low, movements precise, the steady rhythm of care replacing the chaos of the storm, and for a while there was no change, no signal, just the quiet persistence of effort, until finally the door opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, but enough to shift the air in the hallway, and a doctor stepped out, removing his gloves with a measured calm that suggested control, not urgency, and he looked toward Michael, not surprised to see him there, as if he had expected him to stay, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of steadiness that only comes after uncertainty has passed, explaining that both of them were stable, that they had arrived just in time, that the situation could have been very different if even a few more minutes had been lost to the storm, and the words did not come with emotion, they did not need to. Because what they carried was enough, and Michael nodded once, a small movement, but one that held more than relief, it held acknowledgement, acceptance of what had almost happened and what had been avoided, and for a brief moment the world felt balanced again, not perfect, not resolved, but aligned in a way that made sense, and as the doctor returned inside, the door closing once more, the hallway settled back into its quiet rhythm. But something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. And further down the corridor, a television mounted high on the wall flickered with muted images, headlines scrolling across the bottom in a steady stream of information that rarely intersected with places like this. But tonight, it did, because one of those headlines carried a name that had already been spoken in that hallway, a name that did not belong to a truck driver, not entirely, and as the camera on the screen shifted to a city skyline far from the snow-covered road outside, the caption beneath it read clearly enough for anyone paying attention to notice: Michael Hayes, CEO of Hayes Logistics, one of the largest transportation networks in the country, and the contrast was quiet but striking. The image of a man in a tailored suit stepping out of a private jet overlaying the reality of the man standing in a rural hospital hallway with snow still melting from his coat, and for those who might have recognized him, the difference would have been difficult to reconcile, because power rarely arrives in silence. It announces itself, it carries presence, it demands attention, and yet here, there was none of that. Only stillness, only patience, only a man who had made a choice and stayed long enough to see it through, and as the screen continued to play without sound, the story outside that room remained contained, unseen by the millions who would later hear about it. Because for now, it belonged only to this place, this moment, and the quiet aftermath of a storm that had almost taken everything but did not. Morning did not arrive all at once, it revealed itself slowly, a pale gray light pushing through the edges of the storm as if testing whether the night had truly ended, and inside the hospital, the change was subtle but undeniable, the fluorescent glow softened by something natural, something steady, and in a quiet room at the end of the hallway, Emily Carter opened her eyes, not suddenly, not with clarity, but gradually. Like someone returning from a place too far to remember clearly, and for a moment she did not move, did not speak, because awareness comes in layers, and hers was still forming, still trying to understand where she was, what had happened, why the air felt warm instead of sharp, why the silence felt safe instead of empty. And then she heard it, a small sound, close, consistent, and everything else faded, her attention narrowing to that one presence, and she turned her head slightly. Her movements slow but deliberate until she saw it, wrapped carefully beside her. Monitored, protected, alive, and something shifted inside her that no storm could reach, something deeper than relief, deeper than exhaustion, something that did not need words to exist, and her hand moved instinctively, resting near that small, steady life as if confirming what her eyes already knew, and for a moment, the world held still again, not in uncertainty this time, but in quiet recognition of what had been carried through the night, and beyond the door, the hospital had begun to move into its morning rhythm, nurses changing shifts, voices low, footsteps measured, and Michael Hayes remained where he had been, though time had passed. Though the storm outside had begun to fade into memory, and when the doctor stepped out once more, there was a different tone now, less urgency, more certainty, an update that did not change the outcome but confirmed it, and he nodded again, the same small acknowledgement, the same quiet acceptance, and when he was finally invited inside, he paused only briefly before entering, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for a moment that was not his, and as he stepped into the room, the space felt smaller than the storm, smaller than the road, but more significant than both, because this was where everything had led, and Emily looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time not through distance or fading awareness, but clearly, and for a second neither of them spoke, because some moments do not require explanation, they exist fully on their own, and then she did something simple, something that carried more meaning than anything else. She nodded, just once. A quiet gesture that acknowledged what he had done without needing to say it, and he returned the same gesture, not stepping closer, not interrupting the space she held, just present, just there, and outside the window, the last of the storm clouds began to break, light spreading across the snow-covered ground that had hours before been something else entirely, and far from that quiet room, in offices and screens and headlines that had not yet caught up to the night, another story was beginning to form. One that would speak of decisions, of losses, of consequences that follow actions. Whether anyone expects them or not, but inside that room, none of that mattered yet, because what mattered had already been decided, not by power, not by status, but by a moment on a road where someone chose to stop instead of drive past, and as the light grew stronger, filling the room inch by inch, it revealed something simple and undeniable, that some endings do not come from force, they come from presence, and some lives are changed not by what is taken, but by who chooses to stay. The world outside did not wait for quiet moments to settle, it moved forward the way it always does, carrying consequences in places far removed from where decisions were made, and while light filled the hospital room inch by inch, somewhere across the state lines, in a glass office overlooking a city that never paused for reflection, Daniel Whitmore stood in front of a screen that no longer showed numbers the way it had the day before. Because numbers, like trust, can shift without warning. And the calls had started early, one after another, voices no longer measured or polite, questions replacing confidence, concern replacing control, and though he kept his posture steady, though he responded with the same tone that had built his reputation, something underneath it had begun to fracture, something he could not immediately fix, not with influence, not with explanation, and as reports continued to come in, one detail surfaced again and again, not dramatic, not explosive, but persistent, the kind of detail that grows heavier the more it is repeated, discrepancies, delays, decisions made without oversight, all small on their own, but together forming something harder to ignore, and he turned away from the screen for a moment, his reflection caught in the glass behind him, the city stretching out below as if nothing had changed, as if the night before had not happened at all, and yet something had. Something irreversible, though he did not yet see the full shape of it. And back in the hospital, the contrast could not have been clearer, because inside that room, there were no numbers, no reports, no expectations beyond what was right in front of them. Emily Carter resting, her strength returning in quiet increments, her awareness clearer now, her hand never far from the small life beside her, and across the room, Michael Hayes stood near the window, not checking his phone. Not responding to the messages that had already begun to accumulate, because for once, urgency existed somewhere else, and he chose not to follow it, not yet, and when Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but steady, it was not to ask questions about what had happened, not to revisit the storm, or the road or the moment everything changed, it was simply to ask a name, and he answered the same way he had before, without emphasis, without explanation, just Michael, and she held that for a second, as if measuring it against everything she had just lived through, and then she nodded again, a quiet understanding passing between them that did not need to be defined, and outside. The last of the snow began to melt under a sun that had finally broken through, the roads clearing, the world resetting in the way it always does after something has passed, but not everything resets, not every action dissolves with the storm, because somewhere, consequences continue forward, building quietly, taking shape in ways that do not announce themselves until it is too late to undo them, and in that city office, Daniel reached for his phone, scanning messages that no longer felt routine, and for the first time, there was something unfamiliar in his expression, not fear, not yet, but the beginning of recognition, the subtle realization that control is not permanent, that decisions do not disappear simply because they are left behind, and miles away, in a quiet room filled with light, Emily did not look back at any of that, because what she held in her arms had already redefined everything that mattered, and the difference between those two worlds, though separated by distance, was already beginning to unfold. News does not always arrive with noise, sometimes it unfolds quietly, piece by piece, until the full weight of it becomes impossible to ignore, and by late afternoon, the name Daniel Whitmore was no longer confined to boardrooms and private calls, it had begun to appear in places he did not control, financial networks, legal briefings, internal reports that were no longer staying internal. And the pattern was becoming clearer with every passing hour, not a single failure, not a dramatic collapse, but a series of decisions now being questioned, transactions reviewed, partnerships reevaluated, and the kind of attention that once worked in his favor had shifted into something else entirely, something colder, more precise, less forgiving, and he stood there, watching it unfold in real time, his phone vibrating again and again with updates he could not ignore but could not immediately resolve, because control, once cracked, does not return the same way it left, and for the first time, there was no immediate solution, no quick adjustment that could restore the balance he had relied on for years, and somewhere beneath the surface of all of it, there was a connection he had not yet made, a moment he had dismissed, a decision he had driven away from without looking back, and while his world narrowed into screens and consequences, miles away, something entirely different was taking shape, quieter, steadier, and far more lasting, because in that hospital room, Emily Carter was no longer drifting at the edge of awareness, she was present now, fully awake, her movements slow but certain, her focus centered on the small life beside her that had already begun to define everything that came next, and the room itself had changed, no longer a place of urgency but of recovery, of quiet progress marked by small, meaningful signs, a stronger breath, a steadier rhythm. A moment of stillness that no longer felt fragile, and Michael Hayes remained nearby, not as an outsider, not as someone passing through, but as a presence that had chosen to stay beyond the moment of rescue, and when a nurse entered with updates, with routine questions that belonged to a different kind of normal, there was a brief pause again, that same recognition returning, not spoken, not acknowledged directly, but present in the way people adjust when they realize they are standing near someone whose name carries weight beyond the room. And yet nothing about him demanded that recognition. Nothing in his posture or voice suggested anything other than what he had already been that night, someone who stopped, someone who stayed. And as Emily listened to the quiet sounds around her, the distant movement of the hospital settling into its evening rhythm, she did not ask about the storm, she did not ask about the man who had left her on that road. Because some questions lose their urgency when something more important replaces them, and instead, she asked something simple, something forward, about what would happen next, about where she would go, about how she would begin again, and for a moment, no one answered immediately, because the truth was still forming, still unfolding in ways that no one in that room could fully see yet. But what was certain was this: the path ahead would not resemble the one behind her, not in the ways that mattered, and as the sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows across the melting snow, the contrast between those two worlds continued to widen, one unraveling under the weight of its own actions, the other quietly rebuilding from a place of survival into something stronger, something chosen, and though either had reached its conclusion, the direction of both had already been decided. Some consequences do not arrive as a single event, they unfold like a slow tightening, a series of moments that begin to close in from all directions, and by the second day, Daniel Whitmore could no longer separate one problem from another because they had begun to overlap. Legal inquiries that required immediate attention, financial partners asking questions that carried implications, internal teams hesitating in ways they never had before, and the confidence that once defined his presence was now being tested by something far less predictable, something that did not respond to authority or reputation. And as he sat in a conference room surrounded by screens filled with data that no longer aligned in his favor, there was a growing awareness that the structure he had built was not as untouchable as he had believed, that decisions made in private do not remain there forever, and that the distance between action and consequence is often shorter than expected. And for the first time, there was no clear path forward, only a narrowing set of options that seemed to lead back to the same point. The moment everything had begun to shift, though he still did not fully see it, still did not connect it to the night he had left behind without a second thought, and while his world continued to compress under pressure, miles away, something else was expanding, quietly, steadily, in ways that did not demand attention but earned it over time, because in that hospital room, Emily Carter had taken her first steps out of the bed, slow and careful, supported but determined, each movement small but meaningful, and the child she held had already become the center of everything, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a beginning that did not depend on the past to exist, and the conversations around her had changed as well, no longer focused on survival, but on plans, on next steps, on possibilities that had not seemed real just days before, and among those conversations, one stood out not because it was louder, but because it was different, a discussion that did not come from obligation or necessity, but from choice. And when Michael Hayes spoke, it was not as someone offering solutions from a distance, it was as someone who had already stepped into the situation and stayed, offering support not in a way that replaced her strength, but in a way that recognized it. And he explained simply, without complexity, that there were options. That she did not have to return to the same place she had come from, that there were resources available that could give her time, stability, space to rebuild without pressure, and Emily listened, not with immediate acceptance, but with the kind of attention that comes from someone who has learned to measure trust carefully, and she did not answer right away, because answers that matter are not given quickly, they are considered, weighed, understood before they are spoken, and as she looked down at the small life in her arms, then back at him, there was a moment of stillness, a pause that held more meaning than words, and then she nodded, not as agreement to everything, but as acknowledgement of a possibility she had not had before. And outside, the snow continued to melt under a sky that had fully cleared, the storm no longer visible except in the traces it had left behind, and in that contrast between what had been endured and what was now beginning, the shape of the future started to take form, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to prove itself, because it was already happening. The story did not end with headlines. It did not close with a single moment where everything was resolved and neatly understood, because some endings are quieter than that. They unfold in the spaces between what was lost and what is chosen next, and weeks later, when the snow had fully disappeared and the roads had returned to something ordinary, Emily Carter stood by a window in a place that did not carry the weight of her past, holding her child with a familiarity that no longer felt fragile, no longer felt uncertain, but steady, grounded, real. And the silence around her was no longer empty, it was peaceful, the kind of silence that comes after something has been survived, not because the world has changed, but because she had. And across the room, a small table held things that did not exist before that night, documents, plans, possibilities that had been set in motion not by chance alone, but by the choices that followed. And among them was a name she now understood differently, not as a symbol of power or distance, but as a person who had appeared when it mattered and had not disappeared when it was over. And Michael Hayes stood nearby, not as a constant presence, not as someone claiming space that was not his, but as someone who had remained within reach, offering support without expectation, and over time, that presence had become something else, not dramatic, not rushed, but consistent, the kind of consistency that rebuilds trust without demanding it. And outside, life continued in ways that did not pause for individual stories. Traffic moved, people passed, the world remained as complex and unpredictable as it had always been, but inside that space, something had been redefined, not by wealth, not by status, but by the simple act of showing up and staying. And far from there, in offices that once reflected certainty and control, Daniel Whitmore no longer stood at the center of anything. His name now carried a different kind of recognition, one shaped by consequence rather than influence. A quiet unraveling that had not needed a confrontation to begin, because some actions carry their own outcomes without anyone needing to enforce them, and no one in that quiet room spoke about him, not because he had been forgotten, but because he no longer held relevance to what was being built, and that absence said more than anything else could have. And as Emily looked down at the child in her arms, then out at a world that no longer felt like something she had to fear, there was no need for promises, no need for declarations. Because everything that mattered had already been proven in a moment where someone chose not to look away, and in the end, it was not the storm that defined the story, and it was not the man who left, it was the choice that followed, the presence that remained, and the quiet truth that some people lose everything they believed they owned, just to understand the value of something they never deserved to hold.